Sorry about that. The recorder stopped unexpectedly there. But what I was just finishing up with was that calling something war or national security traditionally means that some of the checks in our system, particularly the Supreme Court, do not operate as effectively as in other situations, as opposed to, say, the use of force in the criminal justice situation, where the Supreme Court has often been very willing to step in and define what are rights and responsibilities with respect to criminal defendants. So a huge distinction between looking at uses of force in the context of war, national security, compared to uses of force in, say, the criminal justice system. As I mentioned in Luban's essay this week, he talks about this distinction and gets into some of the important areas where this is just absolutely critical. And at a time when we are increasingly concerned and have seen a few examples and are likely to see more, personally, I don't think that the degree of threat from ISIS based terrorists or ISIS-motivated terrorists is anywhere close to some of the threats we may see with perhaps even a shooting war with Russia over something like Syria. But still, the notion of whatever you want to call them, soldiers, enemy combatants, doing domestic acts of terrorism, and how we will interact with those people in terms of use of force, these are very real issues, and depending on how we view and handle these things ethically and legally makes a huge difference. But Luban rightfully reminds us of some really critical differences between the use of force in a war context compared to civilian law context. The fact that once you've declared war on a quote-unquote enemy, that you can use force against them without any one person having done actually anything other than being on the other team, if you will, right? In our criminal justice system, there obviously has to be evidence that an individual actually did something unlawful for us to trigger some use of force or investigation there. The acceptability of collateral damage couldn't be more different, right? If we imagine what we are willing to live with in terms of the killing of innocent civilians in, say, an American middle-class suburb going after a bad guy, terrorist, drug dealer, mass murderer, etc., that couldn't be more different than what we're typically willing to accept when it comes to, say, a drone attack in Yemen or Pakistan or something like that. So having something be the use of force under our criminal legal system is fundamentally different in this respect than elsewhere. The standard of proof or level of evidence necessary. We've obviously got standards in this country: probable cause, reasonable suspicion, warrant processes for searches, things like that. None of that applies when it comes to a wartime situation. And perhaps most significantly, the notion of a preemptive attack. Now, that doesn't mean we can't preemptively step in to prevent crimes and infiltrate and investigate and things like that. Of course we can do that. But this notion of preemptively attacking someone who hasn't attacked first. In other words, this is different than preemptive attack in a war that's already declared, right? Once you enter into a war, you sign on, your side, and the other side essentially signs on to any sort of preemptive surprise attack that you can get away with, right? But we're talking about to initiate the war in the first place. And this is where things get really tricky. And of course was one of the many criticisms of the Iraq War. That was a preemptive war. Although there were plenty of subtle signs and statements made suggesting a linkage between the 9/11 attacks in Iraq, there was no evidence of that, and there remains no evidence of that today. The notion was that 9/11, if anything, changed our thinking with respect to so-called bad actors like Saddam Hussein. And so we're going to take people like that out potentially before they might get involved with something like another 9/11. But the problem is, and one of the things we'll get into later, is to the extent ethics involves some level of fairness or equal treatment, are we willing to allow the same rules to be applied to us? And so if the notion is that countries are justifiable in preemptively attacking other countries that they view as a threat in some way, does that mean another country can preemptively attack us? And when you look at that Wikipedia article I showed you earlier, and the extent of U.S. military involvement, what some might call meddling, what some would call necessary policing, whatever, you don't have to imagine very long to imagine a country who would say, you guys seem to be one of the main threats to world peace. Look at all the activities you've been in. So we're going to preemptively attack you. Of course, Americans wouldn't stand for that, and I think would view that as totally illegitimate. But does that mean it's illegitimate when we do it? One of those things that critical thinking makes challenging. As I said before, just putting some pictures to this. Taking a look at a civilian sniper, that upper left-hand photo there. A sniper, just heard a podcast the other day raising interesting and troubling issues about a quote-unquote smart rifle that uses onboard GPS, processing, targeting, etc., to, at least as it was described, allow a person with virtually no weapons experience to be able to hit a target consistently with some, at a level consistent with some of the best snipers in militaries around the world. Now, this is supposedly being marketed for recreation and hunting, which is raising interesting ethical questions within hunting communities as a violation of some notion of fairness or fair chase, that ethical hunting involves some level of skill, mastery of the weapon, not just relying on the skill of the weapon, and you'll get into arguments about, scopes and all sorts of things. But point is, imagine a sniper up there, as opposed to a sniper in, say, Aleppo, Syria, or in the Palestinian territory. That's what happens. That bottom picture is when you are an enemy combatant sniper. Not a lot of attention paid to nearby civilian casualties. That would be unthinkable when it comes to, say, a criminal sniper in the civilian context, or at least traditionally it's been unthinkable. Totally different standard. So whether someone is using illegitimate force in what we're calling a criminal way, as opposed to a war or terrorist way, huge difference in terms of typically our response. Or think about drone warfare. Some of the stories that make us think the most is when we hear from particularly children living in parts of the world where now drone overflights are routine, to hear that buzzing faintly, and talking about children saying, I don't want to go out on a sunny day, because that's when they run the drones. You talk about, and I'm sure this is part of the calculation too, the psychological impact of a weapon like that. Where, as opposed to an enemy coming up over the hill in a way that you could imagine in traditional war, now your enemy is almost the finger of God, right? This drone that can bring death from above, something that at least for most of us would be unthinkable, right, to impose on an American community, at least not a comfortable middle-class community. Stay tuned, right? We might see a very different type of law enforcement 20 years from now with respect to very dangerous communities, communities that have often gotten used to, say, law enforcement helicopter flyovers. So who knows what will play out in the future. Let's look at just war theory. This is philosophically the most influential of the approaches to war, and as I mentioned, it's coming primarily out of the Christian and Muslim traditions. There are two parts to just war theory: a set of conditions for entering into a war, and then a set of criteria for how you conduct it once you're in it. So the bottom line here are a set of requirements that have been offered as requirements that need to be met for us to call a war an ethical one, in terms of the reasons for going into it, and then once we're into a war, how we ethically fight one. And these have been, to some extent influential in terms of actual military policy. But let's take a look at these, because they bring up certainly a lot of traditional ethical considerations within war. Let's look at these entering into conditions. One of the traditional ones that might be one of the more questionable ones today is questionable in terms of how useful it is. And that ought to be something you think about and we'll ask and probably discuss a little bit. Are these conditions ones that still have any value today? These were developed at a time, and this is why I had you watch that computer simulation there of that medieval battle there, to give you an idea of what war meant at the time when these were first implemented. And obviously today, particularly for countries like the United States and how we conduct war, technologically sophisticated, wealthier countries, war is a very different ballgame. But traditionally, this meant that war could only be declared by a quote-unquote legitimate authority. It couldn't be just declared by some group of separatists or troublemakers within a society. The notion here was that a legitimate authority would be more responsible in the exercise of power, and therefore you're not getting into all sorts of unnecessary wars. A lot of this set of first criteria gets into the notion that war really is hell. I mean, let's not sugarcoat it. Every war presents its own version of hell in terms of the weapons that are used and the techniques and tactics that are used by the combatants. But what has traditionally driven this view is that war ought to be, and it's actually, of course, one of the criteria, last resort. And these are all then filters, obstacles, speed bumps, if you will, to keep groups of people from not too easily getting into war because of the horrors that it creates. And so the idea here is a legitimate authority and to be less likely to get us involved in unnecessary wars. Now you may be saying, well, I question that one right off the bat, right? Fair point. One of the things that we can look at that makes this just war approach questionable as well is that if we look at the American Revolution, for example, I think we can make a fair case that our American Revolution, our founding action, didn't meet the requirements of a just war. And of course, that may be reason enough for at least patriotic Americans to question the validity of this. Certainly, if you read the English or British histories of the time and their view of the colonists, we'll get into this later, and their tactics, which they viewed as cheating, and they were essentially terrorists of their time, this was an illegitimate revolution. Just cause is, as you might guess, the critical factor, at least by most people's view. You got to have a good reason. Self-defense has traditionally been the most obvious, just as in the personal use of force. Lethal force against an assailant has traditionally been one of the strongest arguments in favor of a lethal response there. So when we expand that to a society level, when a country is attacked, certainly self-defense is viewed as one of the least objectionable causes. Where it gets tricky, as I mentioned, is this notion of preemption. The notion that, okay, here's this power over there, and they're just getting ready to fire the first shot. They haven't done it yet. They maybe didn't even declare war, but they're planning it, or we have good reason to think they're planning it. Do we literally have to wait for them to push the button or fire the shot to fire one ourselves? And I think back to the moral realist who's going to say, well, come on, that's just stupid. You shouldn't have to wait for them to actually do it. We can see a case for this if we've got this clear and convincing evidence, which is one often big hurdle with the intelligence challenges that we have, and imminency, how imminent it is. Very likely to happen, and very likely to happen in the very, very near future. If those conditions are met, then maybe the notion of a preemptive strike that starts a war makes sense. But once you pull away from those criteria and say, well, here's a country over here, and we've got someone who's kind of imbalanced, and it's someone who's treated their own people poorly, and they might, although we're not sure, have access to weapons of mass destruction, and so it's a possibility that person might do us harm. That's a very different situation from the first scenario I mentioned that makes preemption a much more dicey prospect there. What about assisting allies? Some of our military alliances, most notably NATO, the idea here is of collective security, that you become a part of a team, and that deters others from attacking any one member of the team, kind of the old logic behind gang membership. What about humanitarian intervention? Gross violations of human rights that occur within a society. Is that an appropriate cause for military involvement? As horrific as those are, is that a reason to become involved militarily? So looking at the ultimate cause, are you only going to become involved militarily, war, whatever we want to call it, in cases of imminent self-defense, or using your military to achieve other types of objectives, maybe even economic ones? Some of your citizens have a lot of money and profit tied into factories that are threatened by a situation in another country. Is that the legitimate use of the U.S. military? That's what this cause is getting at. One of the sad cases that brought this question up is the Rwandan genocide. Hard to know exactly how many were killed, but certainly close to 1 million. This was in the early 90s. The United States was in many ways trigger shy because of the Black Hawk Down incident in Somalia, if you've read the book or seen the movie there, and that really discouraged any sort of military intervention. This was viewed as an internal conflict, a civil war, in which case the United States had no what it felt was national interests at stake. This was a fairly primitive genocide in terms of the technology. Most people killed with knives and machetes. A fairly small military force could have easily gone in and stabilized the bloodshed with very little risk to those involved, considering the sorts of weapons and materials a country like the United States or other military powers. But we stayed out. We stayed out, and more than a few cynics some pointed to race, said that we felt the need to go into, Kosovo and places in Europe where these were mostly white faces that were at risk, and here it's mostly black faces, or cynically that there were no resources in Rwanda, right? That if this were closer to the oil fields or something where we wanted to keep that region stable because of a national economic interest or a resource, we might have gone in. Now, we can debate about that too, but the point is this the sort of thing that might trigger the just cause criteria within just war theory? This notion of last resort I mentioned before, because war is so horrible, not just directly the people who fight it, although that's most acute, but a whole series of ripple effects of people and countries that get involved in war. The traditional view is that all other options must be exhausted. And in the case of the Iraq War, this was hotly debated that Scott Ritter, their UN's weapons inspector, Iraq was in fact allowing the UN weapons inspectors in, although it was quite clearly not being as open and transparent as the UN would love. But Ritter himself said that he felt that he had a good feel for what was there, and of course we've found nothing since that would suggest that his assessment was wrong. Think about, though, for a minute if China or Russia decided it would be a good idea to have the UN or some other group take a tour of the United States and confirm the number of our WMDs. Of course, the United States has the most weapons of mass destruction in the terms of, at least we believe, nuclear warheads. Yeah, that would be unthinkable, right? Can you imagine what the American public how it would respond to a demand or even a request by an enemy or even a friend? We don't share the, well, maybe we share with friends, who knows, allies, where our stuff is and whether we have a right to it in a sense. And this is where I say it gets back to the central issue of, do the same rules apply to everyone? What we, of course, want to do as a country is what I would suggest many of us are tempted to do and do as individuals, egoists. We want to maximize our own personal benefit. And that often means allowing ourselves to operate by one set of rules and applying a much more stringent and restrictive set of rules to others. But of course, it's not very difficult to see that from those others' perspectives, that's not so attractive of an idea, right? As I said before, this famous quote, probably a lot of folks have been responsible for it, but General Sherman, the U.S. Civil War, among others, famously, war is hell, and that's a good thing, because otherwise we would grow to love it too much, or like it too much, or get used to it. Every war, as I said, has its costs, its horrific costs, in terms of those who die, and in many cases those who live, something we know all too well with some of the men and women who serve and come back to us in our classes, in our communities, and struggle with the long-term impact of war. Nothing new. We've got a label for it today, PTSD, and shell shock in World War I. There's, I don't think, reason to believe that that is particularly new. Every type of war has unique aspects to it. Drone warfare, for example, and concerns about dehumanizing killing, but also seeing the impacts of your killing very up close in a way that takes drone warfare back to more traditional warfare, where you killed people right in front of you, as opposed to more recent wars of the 20th century, where you launched missiles or dropped bombs, often at a great distance. And you could only imagine what the consequences were. They weren't in front of you unless a journalist happened to take a picture and show that to you. The cost of war may well be necessary. Remember, the just war tradition is not a pacifist tradition. But it does say that in light of all of the many costs, all the other options ought to be exhausted. And that is one of the criticisms of the Iraq War, is not that there shouldn't have been any, perhaps, U.S. military involvement. There was, of course, a no-fly zone over northern Iraq that, by most accounts, was effective. Was a full-on war necessary? And of course, now we know that not only are we concerned about more backward-looking things, people who fight in the war and what happens during that, but future. What's the human cost in terms of people who are who suffer long-term? The use of drugs, of course, that we just recently looked at. Suicide rates. Or the creating of instability in parts of the world that then groups like ISIS arise out of, which we now know is quite clearly the case with the destabilizing of conditions in Iraq. This can be a tricky one to comply with. The notion here is that there should be a reasonable chance for success. By this account, battles like the Alamo would not have passed the test here. The notion here is that if you don't really have a chance of winning, why get involved in the first place? And that sounds like a cowardly cut and run sort of thing. But if there's any wisdom to this, the notion is if it's futile that you're going to not be successful, why impose the costs of war? Try to find some other resolution, maybe even being subjugated by the other power, short of full-on complete slavery. You look at the Roman example and how they colonized areas. They gave them a fair amount of independence and control. Certainly wasn't ideal, but you're not dead. Your society is not, obliterated off the face of the earth. The notion here is that you don't put your society through something unless you don't have a reasonable chance of success. You might say, well, how do we define success? Good question, particularly in light of more recent conflicts. Folks like Rumsfeld and Cheney under George Bush there were pretty optimistic about how things would go in Iraq. And they were correct, certainly, in terms of the success of toppling Saddam Hussein and his sort of paper tiger of a military, if you can call it that. You remember, maybe not remember, all of the Iraqi soldiers sort of, throwing up their hands before shots were fired and abandoning their vehicles and all of that. No, it was not difficult at all to get in there, which by some people's measure only illustrates that the extent to which Iraq was not any sort of significant military threat, certainly to the United States in terms of its formal territory, but even some of its neighbors. But the problem is what happens after. I was at Colin Powell, his old Pottery Barn rule: if you break it, you own it. That was kind of our approach in Germany and Japan, and we're still there. Who knows, maybe in 20, 40 years there. But you rebuild those societies. You're stuck rebuilding them if you can, or else you end up with a power vacuum in which a group like ISIS develops. So it seems that all of our planning, or the vast majority of it, was how to go in and kick you-know-what and get Saddam out of power. Not much planning at all about what happens after, or happened after, and that needs to be part of the equation. What would we say today? Cheney still defends his decisions, but most people look back at Iraq with regret. Of course, our presidential candidates, both wanting to distance themselves from their early support. I think very few people, knowing much of what we know today, would have said that was a good idea. This criteria is saying, to the extent we can, we need to use some good critical and maybe even some creative thinking in terms of playing out some scenarios here. You're beginning to hopefully see the power of this sort of approach here. Say, okay, we get Saddam out and we remove some of the worst of the worst leaders. Then what? Then what? Obama is often criticized as being a more cautious, hesitant leader in some ways, but from reports of people he works with say that is a product of his thinking, that as opposed to someone like Bush, who is much more sort of, lay it out for me, short-term thinking, this is the obstacle, let's do it. Obama is always 2 or 3 steps down the road thinking, okay, what does this create? And often, although we can agree or disagree on specific decisions, what he at least is imagining is an outcome that's not all that great. And in areas like Syria, if you even begin to peel back the layers of that mess and look at all the groups involved, and the fact that in many ways it's a proxy war for other groups that aren't explicitly involved, including most notably the United States and Russia, you can start to see the wisdom of the approach of at least thinking these things out a few steps. What do you have next? And as bad, as unstable as things may be today, could they be worse? And in many cases, the answer, yes. But it's hard to know. Who has the crystal ball, right? People like Larry Lindsey, who's the guy to the left of Bush here, was ridiculed for saying that the cost of the Iraq War would be between 100 and 200 billion dollars. Rumsfeld and others, laughed at him openly, said it was baloney. Today, the cost of the war is around 2.4 trillion with a T. So Lindsey was wrong, but he was wrong in the other direction. And that is most likely going to climb to 5 to 6 trillion. And that's not even including any of the damage and cost associated with groups like ISIS and our response to them, which I think are consequences of the Iraq War. So it can be tough to know what the reasonable prospect for success. And back to our friends, the American colonists, what was the likelihood of success of the American Revolution? If you know your American history, the smart money was not on the colonists, and it was really only until another superpower of the time, particularly the French, sitting on the sidelines because they had already had plenty of bloody noses with Britain and didn't want necessarily another one, waited until there was a decisive enough battle to come into the picture, which, among other things, turned the table. But certainly Britain didn't give the colonists much of a chance, and even a fair number of early Americans didn't. Looking at a cost-benefit analysis, what the just war criteria often refer to as proportionality, can be extremely difficult. Now, this is asking that you do some of this before getting involved in war. And again, the idea is if the costs are likely to outweigh the benefits, then it's unethical to enter into a war in the first place. And these are just some of the things that we still debate about. Some of these, I think, could have been anticipated, some not so much. But it can be so very difficult to ballpark some of these things. Some of the benefits that were mentioned and some not mentioned, but I think that were very clear. Not so much oil in terms of wanting to go in and take their oil, something ironically Mr. Trump has said he would have done, which would have opened up a whole other universe of problems. But needing to have stability in an oil-producing region of the world in which oil is, of course, our economic lifeblood. Saddam Hussein as being a threat in post-9/11 America with WMDs. We'll get into that shortly. He did have them at one time, and we know that because we gave him something that doesn't get frequently mentioned in the kind of mainstream media's account of this. When we look at our costs, of course, very clear and easier to do that today, looking in hindsight, but considerable loss of life. And again, the vast majority of the monetary expense, which is not insignificant. If you take a look on a per capita, per taxpayer, per U.S. taxpayer, we pay federal taxes. The average tab up to this point is about 20 grand. Pretty significant. And of course, for plenty of people, their cost is much greater, right? Those 4,500 or so casualties. And of course, the many people who were not actually killed, but injured psychologically, physically. And not even getting into the large number of Iraqi civilian casualties. Now, I'm not saying those are all or even most the result of direct U.S. Killing in war, but the instability that was created among groups, the collateral damage, etc. Again, these are civilian casualties. These aren't the targets that we're after here. Significant loss of life. Problems in infrastructure, the destruction of antiquities. This is a part of the world that's considered one of the cradles of civilization. As good a job as we did protecting the oil ministry in Iraq, apparently not much protection was thought about, much less provided, to many of the museums in and around Iraq. And we now know how many of those artifacts have made their way if they weren't destroyed, onto the black market. I know that may seem trivial to many of you, certainly compared to some of these other costs, but you start to see how complicated this gets. Let's look at the second side of the just war theory, and that's this whole idea of conditions for conducting a war. And two key principles here, discrimination and proportionality. And this gets into comparisons with our criminal justice system as well. But the idea here is that you're not going to intentionally target non-combatants. This is where we get into the so-called collateral damage issue here. That you have to differentiate or discriminate. That's really what discrimination means, even though we tend to think of it always in the negative sense. We got into this with LGBT issues. To discriminate simply means to make a differentiation between. And on the civilian side, we of course discriminate between criminals and non-criminals. There's nothing unjust, typically, we view with that, depending on how we define a criminal and all of that. But the traditional view is that you should focus the damage to the extent possible on actual combatants, people who have signed on, in a sense, to accept violence, as well as deal it out to others. The idea of the combatants. When you put on the uniform, pick up the sword, that's part of the deal. It's not part of the deal that innocent folks who just happen to be in the area, often not a lot of options for getting out of the area, at least in modern times, they shouldn't be responsible for that. And then proportionality, right? You don't drop a nuke on someone. Saddam Hussein was famous for standing out, on his golden porch there with an old Russian World War II military rifle and shooting it up in the air and say how he was going to, go after the United States and other enemies and bring them to their knees. You can say a lot of things, but you don't drop a nuke on someone who's saying that, right? That's an extreme example, but the notion of you're supposed to respond with rough proportionality. If you've got a couple of snipers in a small town, you're not carpet bombing the entire area. I think Ted Cruz got in trouble for a statement suggesting something like that, making the sand glow or something, that was going to take care of ISIS. Well, it might, although probably wouldn't have for a variety of reasons. But it certainly would have taken care of many innocent civilians, and that's, of course, one of the many new wrinkles to war. Unlike the medieval battles there, where you could and did contain your combat, and therefore, and the nature of the weapons was such that you weren't going to have a lot of unintentional non-combatant casualties. The ball game, of course, very different in the 20th and 21st centuries. The bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as well as Dresden, Germany, which doesn't get nearly the amount of attention. Kurt Vonnegut, of course, famously wrote about this in Slaughterhouse-Five. He talks about the traditional bombing of Dresden that was essentially payback for the ruthless German bombing of England. Of course, the military significance of Dresden, like Hiroshima and Nagasaki, is hotly debated. But these were meant as very strong symbols and deterrences, punishments in some people's view. Vonnegut writes about the fires burning so hot in Dresden that people's shoes were melting off, and then, of course, their skin as they're running down the streets and trying to escape the inferno. And, of course, we've all seen some of the carnage associated with the nuclear weapons. We don't have time to get into it here, but certainly there's an ongoing debate, and I don't think it's an easy one, about the decision, both militarily, ethically, to drop the nuclear weapons. Symbolically, it still plays a role. It's not unusual to hear more than a few other countries remind us, or themselves, that for all of our talk of WMDs, the United States is the only country to have actually used them in terms of war. Now, that's true, But of course, the traditional U.S. response is that they were, if anything, a necessary evil. And some of the points that are raised, and many of them fair points, is that for all the attention that the nuclear weapons received, just because of the fear factor, if you will, of nuclear energy, and I think that was part of the calculation to use them, create fear, psychological warfare, if it means getting your enemy to agree to an end to the war sooner, and therefore less loss of life overall in a utilitarian sense, maybe. But what about the fire bombings of Tokyo that had gone on for quite some time before the nuclear bombs, and very lethal? Much of the Japanese construction was wood and not paper, but cardboard material, very flammable. That was well known. It was very easy to start just huge conflagrations with traditional fire bombs that had killed most likely tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands. Is conventional bombing really any better, in a sense, than nuclear bombing? And then this issue that sounds very cruel and calculating, do all lives count equally? In other words, this notion that when people talk about, well, certain people had to be killed, civilians, but it brought the overall number of casualties down, particularly military casualties. We get someone saying, well, as a military life, does it count equally in that sort of analysis as a civilian one? And I don't mean, don't misunderstand me, saying that somehow military life is not valuable in some inherent sense, but the notion that because folks in the military, assuming they volunteered, now we see that the draft and conscription is ethically complicated, but assuming someone volunteered, you say, well, they signed up for that. So that puts them in a different ethical position than someone who didn't. That's what we mean by valuing the lives equally or not. We're not saying that they're somehow worth more or less by the nature of what they do, but in terms of what they signed on for, right? If Kant would say if we're respecting people's autonomy and free choice, then we respect them in terms of the choices they make. And a person who chooses to be a combatant is, in a sense, choosing to put themselves in a situation where their life may be taken or harmed in a way that a civilian isn't. So that's what we mean by that. But the traditional view, justifying their use, is that, and I think there's a fair amount of strength to this argument, is that the Japanese certainly had not exhibited a willingness to surrender. And it would have involved a great deal of loss of life, probably both military and civilian, to have to go island to island, place to place, and defeat or kill the Japanese army. And so by using these very devastating, fear-inducing weapons, it brings Japan to the table sooner, overall loss of life is reduced. But the point is a lot of ethical wrinkles in that decision. Of course, other factors too. People alleging that Truman had his eye much more on the former Soviet Union than necessarily wanting to bring the Japanese to the surrender table. That these were dropped more with an eye towards, hey, guess what, Uncle Joe Stalin? These got a couple of these for you. Post-war, that people are already thinking of. There's really little question at that point that the United States would be victorious over Japan. And the only question was how soon that would happen and to what extent there would be more loss of life. That these were dropped as an example to particularly the former Soviet Union, who would then become, of course, our adversary in the Cold War. Mentioned before that as you think about the drone warfare issue and compare that to war as described and portrayed in that computer simulation, we of course find a very different ballgame. And so one of the questions that comes up, and that we'll talk about, to what extent are these just war criteria, maybe just some rather than others, still relevant today? Or do we need some new ethical guidelines that reflect the modern nature of war? It's a fair question. One of your essayists this week, writing about this, asking, is there any realistic scenario in which, judged by the just war criteria, the 21st century United States would start and wage a war that it didn't consider just? We always have a moral rationale, the just cause. We always consider our actions defensive, even if the aggression hasn't happened yet, that issue of preemptive war. We always think we have a reasonable chance of success. We always consider ourselves to be a competent, legitimate authority. And we always claim to have waited as long as possible to act. Last resort. He accuses us, says we're inclined to join or start wars for the loftiest of reasons. Given this fact, ad bellum, this is Latin for the just war criteria, primarily provide an additional moral and theological imprimatur, in other words, a stamp of approval, we would be inclined to do anyway. In other words, rather than using these as they were intended, as sort of a litmus test in good faith to decide whether you get into the war, he's suggesting that we have all sorts of other reasons, perhaps not so ethical or lofty, that will pull us into wars or push us into them. And then we just sort of add these as an after-the-fact rubber ethical stamp to say, well, no, we're doing this for good ethical reasons. So certainly here's someone, and free to agree or disagree, suggesting that these are fairly meaningless, that they're not going to make a big difference. Well, let's look at drone warfare here a little bit. I think this is a great example of the complications of something like the just war theory, and whether our ethics needs to be updated for modern circumstances. I have on here recent studies. There's a lot of argumentation about this, and part of it is, for reasons you might imagine, our government has been not particularly willing, and maybe they shouldn't be, right? Maybe we're not entitled to transparency in every aspect of government behavior. There probably is a need for selective secrecy in some areas, but we don't have real good hard data on success rate. We can certainly confirm people who have been killed, plenty of humanitarian organizations out there, and those groups that have done that have concluded that the success rate is fairly low. In other words, you're getting less than 10% of the people you're wanting to get, that you are killing far more civilians in the process of trying to get the bad people. And to the extent, at least part of war, and now we're getting into sort of the overarching goals or motivations of war, is about the so-called winning of hearts and minds, as I think Bush put it. Maybe you are a better person than I am, but I could guess that if my innocent child or family member had been killed by a drone, if I wasn't wanting to go to war against the United States, I might want to now. Like I say, a lot of these people, that doesn't appear to be their view. They view the casualty as something, this unintentional cost of war that the United States is in for a good reason. But to the extent a percentage of these people don't, which I think, if we are honest, we can say we could imagine that pretty easily, is this really a good long-term strategy? What was the old, I can't remember, a Greek myth of Hercules, right, and the Hydra? Every time he cut one of the heads off, two would sprout back in its place. That's not a very good long-term strategy of cutting off the heads, right? So if you create 2 or 3 terrorists of the future for every one that you kill, not a good long-term strategy. And there have been more than a few folks from some of these areas that we've conducted drone attacks in who say, your classic, you may be winning a battle here and there, but you're losing the war. That you ultimately don't get these societies or significant parts of them to be friendly towards you when you have what's going on in terms of innocent civilians being killed. Of course, one of the more down-to-earth reasons, and this gets really concerning. In fact, we've already seen a couple of examples, not here in the States, but heard the other day of ISIS modifying some hobby caliber drones to carry a small bomb payload, whatever. Certainly not something that would do any kind of great damage. But even of other states. One of the complicating factors here is where we fly these things. Countries that we are not formally at war over, in some cases they've given us explicit permission, in some cases not so much. What if other countries want to start flying drones over the United States? Saying things like Turkey has said, for example, that one of the groups that it considers a terrorist group is a group that has people here in the United States. They're not the on-the-ground terrorist type of people, but the leaders, etc., that in Turkey's view are just as dangerous as some of our terrorists. And in their view, we're not being cooperative for handing them over. Are they allowed to do a droning or pluck someone off the streets like our CIA appears to have done in a couple cases and whisk these people away to black site for torture or enhanced interrogation techniques? Again, unthinkable. Can you imagine what the immediate American reaction would be if Russia or China or Turkey droned an American building with someone who they insisted was a terrorist inside and there was some American loss of life? But can we very well hold other countries to standards that we ourselves aren't following? Many have said that, and this will probably be part of Obama's legacy, ironically, since he's often stereotyped by his critics as being, the softy and all of that, is his drone policy that has come under a fair amount of criticism from particularly many on the left, liberal, progressive side of things. They're, of course, supposed to be so appreciative of Obama, right, his supporters, right? You do have people who take different views, who might like Obama's policies in some areas but dislike them for others. His drone policy will probably be one of the lasting aspects of his legacy. And as we'll see when we get into debates about torture and Guantanamo Bay and all of that, some of the cynical out there have said that Obama, or at least in his leadership, his staff, learned the lessons of Bush's approach, which is you don't capture and interrogate these people and then have to deal with the messiness involved that we'll get into later. Are these POWs, are they enemy combatants, etc.? You drone them. Problem solved. Right? If someone is under suspicion, no, you're under no obligation to capture them and bring them back and do all this other stuff. You drone them. Now, whether that's an accurate, cynical view or not, I don't know, but it raises many, many questions, including ones about due process. If the person is a traditional war combatant, then of course there's not a due process problem, right? Any more than there's a due process problem in dropping bombs over the Viet Cong or something, or the Germans or whatever. But when a person isn't fitting into that category for whatever reason, is a so-called enemy combatant, or in some cases has multiple citizenship levels and is arguably an American citizen, then no, you can't do that as a constitutional matter. Gets tricky, gets messy very, very quickly. This Foundation for Fundamental Rights, as I mentioned before, collecting testimonies of young people living in parts of the world with regular drone activity. I don't like blue skies anymore. That really makes, that hit home. The costs of war. In some cases, they may be necessary costs, the so-called necessary evil. But as I said, taking the long view in terms of wanting people to have a more favorable view of the United States when that time comes to whether to decide, will I fall in with this group of terrorists? Will I be self-radicalized? Will I believe these things I read about the United States on the internet as part of that process of self-radicalization? Does a policy like this ultimately do more harm than good? Related question that this and other groups ask: the cost of one of these missiles that are fired from at least the war drones. We've got drones that aren't involved in actually shooting anything, but simply picking up information. In fact, that's probably the much more common use, is more than twice, or almost as much twice, as running an entire school in an area of Afghanistan or Pakistan. And so more than a few people, and some of them are more pacifist in general, but even if you're not, even if your goal is to ultimately keep bad people from doing bad things to us, right? That's a pretty generally stated goal. Which one of those expenditures works more in our favor? You might say, well, maybe we ought to be doing both, but you get the idea. Broad questions here, and not just narrow ethical ones. Well, let's look at terrorism here a little bit. We define terrorism in a number of different ways here, and maybe I will pause this and start a new video so that I can break it up a little bit